we're going to talk about the portal. And I have a co-presenter who you don't see. So McKenna Berkman is a member of our team at Microsoft, and she helped put a lot of this deck together. So I really felt I should give her credit for that, even though she's not physically here in London. She's back in Seattle. So my name is Erin Stellato. I am a program manager at Microsoft. I've only been at Microsoft for about a year. Prior to becoming a PM to join the company, I was a consultant in the SQL Server world for about 9 years, and before that, I worked for a software company. So I've been in the SQL space for a long time, before we had Azure, and I will admit that at heart, I'm an engine girl. The Azure and all of that is not where I live most of the time. I'm on the experiences team with McKenna, and McKenna and Jess do most of the portal work. So I'm just telling you this so that I set expectations, and that there may be things that you ask me, and I'm like, I'm not 100% sure, but I can find the answer for you. Probably not within the next 50 minutes, but I can find the answer for you. So we put together this session because sometimes I think that folks don't truly understand when and why they need to use the portal and what some of the things that it offers are. And because sometimes there are times when it's necessary to go to something else. So full disclosure, I am the PM for Management Studio and for Azure Data Studio. So I have another session this afternoon on Azure Data Studio where I get to talk about that. So we'll see what we can do here in the portal, and then when we really kind of have to go elsewhere, when that's really necessary. This is the abstract. I want to make sure that you're in the right spot. My joke here is that if you realize a couple minutes in you are not, and you want to get up and leave, I am not offended. I have teenagers who get up and walk out of the room on me all of the time, right? So not a foreign experience in my world. I'm not going to be offended. I want to make sure that you get the most out of your day. So the goal, again, as I said, is to really understand what the portal is. You may or may not have some preconceived notions. So since we're a smaller group, if we can make this a little bit more interactive, that's more fun for me and potentially for you. How many of you use the portal? First of all, let me just start with that. Yes, yes, yes. Not so much yet, right? So and I don't mean I'm not trying to call you out or embarrass you in any way, shape, or form, but you're kind of like, why would I use the portal? Like, what am I supposed to do with it? Is that kind of like what you're thinking?
I use SSMS instead of Azure mostly, so I use Azure.
So you use Management Studio for all the things that you need to do, even in Azure, right?
We don't work with Azure at all.
You don't work with Azure at all. So if you're going to go to Azure, what do you need to understand, right? Kind of, and then the rest of you are in the portal some amount of time, right? Throughout your day-to-day thing. Okay. So I hopefully we'll present some information that's new to you so that you might walk away with either maybe a new feature, a new experience that you weren't familiar with within the portal. So fundamentally, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So just kind of a basic overview that's going to ground this session, and a few high-level details before we dive a little bit deeper. So obviously the portal, well, I shouldn't say obviously, but the portal is a web interface, right? Supported across multiple browsers and OSs. And I actually had no idea that there is a desktop app and there is a mobile app, right? Yeah, it takes a note. See, this was something I learned. We put it when McKenna was pulling all of this together. They don't necessarily, the mobile app in particular has a more limited experience. Okay, but you're able to view resource use. You can start VMs. From there, you can do some monitoring, right, from there as well. So in a pinch, it's a nice option to have. This is, as a browser goes, right, pretty lightweight. Doesn't require you to do any kind of updates, right? If it updates, you automatically get those benefits. You don't have to take any extra steps or do a download or anything like that. So you're always on the latest and greatest, which is a pro and a con, because for those of you who've been using the portal for a while, you know that it would seem we can suddenly switch things up on you. I feel like we do this much less than we used to. When I first started into Azure, it was kind of a running joke for folks who did sessions, was that every time you went and did a session, you had to go through everything and like take screenshots again because it had changed since the last time. I feel like we do that much less now, and we have a much better process for rolling out changes, et cetera. So it allows you to see and manage your resources, right? This is, sometimes I think as a data person, maybe as the DBA, you have databases that are in Azure, but you're not really spending time in the portal because your activity, right, your job function isn't related to that. But when you need to create a new resource, make changes to it, this would be one of the places for you to go. You can create custom dashboards within the portal to basically figure out what are the most important metrics that you want to monitor and look at those, which allows you then to kind of understand what the usage looks like for a particular resource, for a database, for example. And I tend to think of it, right, first and foremost as kind of my subscriptions and my resources, but there is a ton of Azure services that you can access from in here, right? So the Azure Marketplace, if you go into, right, you've got, let me make sure I hit the right button, right? See more in all services here, see more in the Marketplace. So this is just a short list of what services and products we have available. I can't go through all of them, right? We don't have enough time for that, but it's a central location from which to start and then branch out into what else you might be looking for within the cloud. We kind of put this into a task grouping because this is how my brain tends to work. So we've broken this up into 4 different categories, with the first being sort of the operational tasks that you might have to complete. Managing your resources, right, provisioning from here as well, scaling databases, very quick and easy to do. I'm going to show that a little bit later. If you need disaster recovery scenarios, you need to create your users, right, whether they're logins or whether you're doing Azure Active Directory, and then managing that subscription. What I find is that a lot of folks don't have full subscription access, right? You have access to a limited amount of things within your subscription typically, correct? Yes, head nods are good here. Okay. And what is, I think, sometimes interesting and challenging is that the folks who do have full access to your subscription aren't the people that aren't necessarily the right people who have to go in and do the resource creation, management, et cetera. It's a little bit of a tricky balance, right? For those of you that are developers and DBAs, you kind of already experienced that balance when the developers want to do something and the DBAs don't want to give them access, right? It's kind of that same push-pull, but in the portal scenario. So I understand that can be a challenge for folks. You can do some light development in here. We have a query editor. How many of you knew that there was a query editor within the portal? Okay, not quite half of the room. Did you know that that is one of the most visited pages, blades, within the portal? Completely shocked me. Never underestimate the power of a query editor. It is still in preview. It is something that we would like to get out of preview. I'm not sure when we're going to be able to make that happen. Great place to get your connection strings, right? When you need to connect from another source, from another tool like Management Studio or Azure Data Studio. And then you can do some PowerShell, Azure CLI from there as well. If you are not a DBA by training or haven't done a lot of DBA work, you still have the ability to go in and monitor performance, right? I tend to do this with tools like Query Store and Extended Events and the DMVs. But for folks who are newer to Azure, who are newer to SQL, they don't have that insight and they don't frankly need it, right? We have intelligent performance blades as well as query performance insight that help you understand what queries are executing against your databases, what needs your attention, right? What isn't performing well. Along with the monitoring. So you have Azure Monitor, we have the tabbed overview, which I'm going to talk about a little bit as well. And then monitoring replication as well, monitoring geo-replication. So there's a host of different tasks that we could accomplish here within the portal, but again, not everything necessarily fits into what needs to happen. So I want to talk about like when is the most appropriate time for you to use that. So for folks who are new to Azure and SQL, and not just in the data world, but folks who are students, right, who maybe need to spin up a resource for a class. This is something that we're seeing more and more, where universities, colleges are going to cloud because they can create resources pretty quickly and pretty cheaply. So students are a big user of the portal, as well as those who prefer to learn more from a graphical scenario. So again, provisioning resources, creating these, not something that you would do through Management Studio, through Azure Data Studio. You have to go through the portal to do this. Anything that you're doing related to your networking, which I will admit is not a strength of mine, right, has to happen also through the portal. Now, in terms of object development, you could do this in the portal with the query editor, but it's very slimmed down and pretty limited, and if you're not comfortable with T-SQL, may not be the best option for you. In this scenario, we tend to direct folks over to Azure Data Studio or Management Studio to start getting created with the objects, with the schema within their database. And then for the monitoring performance recommendations, you have a choice, right? Where are you most comfortable? If you're a student, if you're new, you may find that the portal is a better place for you. If you've got hundreds of databases that you're trying to monitor or manage, you can still do that from the portal, but you may prefer to do that from a tool that you're more comfortable with, like Azure Data Studio or SSMS. Okay. A few things that are unique to the portal that you really can't do from one of the tools, and this isn't necessarily an exhaustive list, right? This is what we see most commonly used or we think are really most helpful. Creating, managing, deleting your logical servers, anything related to your networking, right? Two primary use cases and two very frequently used sets of blades within the portal. If you're doing failover groups for Azure SQL DB or for SQL MI, you're going to configure those within the portal as well. Elastic pools, which I have a nice demo to show how you can create those, delete, move databases between, right? Manage those pools. And then scale your resources up or down. I feel like we've done a nice job making this a little bit easier to view and understand within the portal. And then the connection strings. I never remember any of my Azure SQL database connection strings, so I am always hopping into the portal to grab that as well. A few other things. Actually, I think I got everything on here. Okay. So do I have any questions so far? Particularly for those of you who are newer to this. Are we good? Okay. So leveraging a little bit more, your logical SQL servers, right? So within my subscription here, right, the logical server is a collection of databases. So I could do one logical server per one database, or I can create one server and have multiple databases within that. It's entirely up to you. This is where you're going to manage those logins, set up any firewall rules, any auditing rules, policies, and failover groups. One of the things that I find most challenging in here is the firewall rules. Where a user is going to log in from, let's say, one of the tools, and they don't have access for creating the firewall rule. That's either then something that you have to come in and set up that rule within here, or give them the appropriate permissions to create those firewall rules as needed. Ideally, once you've come in here and set up any of this configuration, you don't have to come back into this screen repeatedly, right? But every time you're setting up that database, you want to make sure that you're paying attention to this networking and configuration. Your logical server can exist in a different region than in the resource group. Those of you that spend time in the portal, for failover reasons, or for availability reasons, you may want to have those exist separately. But anytime you create the database in the server, it has to exist within that same region. So elastic pools are pretty cool. So this is rather than having your resource created and potentially creating it with more CPU, right, than it needs, and so you're paying for that, right? You can benefit here with the elastic pools. They're much more cost-effective for managing your scaling of databases that can be very unpredictable. So this really goes back to your workload, right? So when I think about traditional on-prem environments that I used to work with as a consultant, a lot of those were high volume, needed low latency, right, high performance, very busy systems that were continually pushing the resources of the hardware on which they exist. But as the cloud has evolved and as folks have moved to the cloud, there's, I think, sometimes a very different model of database that ends up being used, where it's sporadically used, right? And where the performance required is not as predictable, right? So if you think of, for example, vendors that host a lot of databases within the clouds, right? You may have one customer that pushes really hard, right, on their system, and then you have other ones that use that much less. Or you have bursts of activity within a system based around holidays or times of year or something like that, where all of a sudden usage increases, and then it completely scales back down right after the holiday shopping season is over. So those scenarios, right, purchasing way more than you need just for that special event is not cost-effective, smart at all. So elastic pools give you the ability to have the resources that you need and pay for them then only as you actually need to use them. So this is controlled more from a budget perspective, right? Not from a potential demand, potential requirement perspective. So n number of databases can exist within that elastic pool. And again, you're creating, managing, and deleting these all within the portal, as well as monitoring performance and activity. And this is nice because we can do this at the pool level, as opposed to trying to monitor things at the database level and then do any kind of math to figure out, am I still within the resources, right, of my pool? So if this will work correctly, right, so we got a little bit of demo here. So within my logical pools menu, within my settings, I can see my elastic pool, and we've already got one configured here. We've got, let's see, where are we? Here we go. Right, so we have navigation where we're configuring or deleting. We want to create one. And then we have information fundamental to what we have in that elastic pool. And then we can look at resource utilization for that pool over time, as well as how much disk space is being used. Right, so really quick high-level snapshot of what usage of this looks like. So if we come in here to the configuration of that, we can see what tier we're on, the service tier, right? And this is going to affect, obviously, total cost. So we have a variety, right? Basic versus general purpose versus critical. And from within there, then we can also go ahead and make changes to the configuration of the cores of the memory with an estimate here of compute cost down there. You've got the slider bars, which I think sometimes make it easier, right? To manage or to configure what we want here. So how many cores do I want? What's the max amount of data that I think is going to be needed for this pool? And then do I want any level of redundancy, and how does that affect my total cost? So this gets way easier to configure than trying to have a conversation with somebody on your storage side, right, or your hardware side to say, this is what I think I'm going to need. How much is this going to cost me? This blade makes it a little bit easier to understand what the different costs would be based upon the changes that I want to make. So we've gone ahead, we've got this deployed, and then we're going to create database within here, within our Elastic pool. And creating the database is really pretty simple, right? Whatever database name we want to assign here, we can go ahead and do that, and it's going to be part of our server and part of that Elastic pool. So I think within this one, we're going to have a few databases. Obviously, I'm not doing this demo because we don't ever want to, at this point, rely on my internet connectivity. So I've switched to recording some of these demos because it's a little bit easier. So here we get to see resource utilization over time. Do I want to look by CPU, by I/O, by log I/O? And then I have the ability to slice and dice. So I want to look at min, max, and average. So kind of a query store-like view for those of you who have used that before. But this is going to be total resource utilization across the pool. And then I can specify kind of a window of time. Now, I don't have the ability to like dig in like per hour. I'm looking more over a range of time until I come into this view where I'm looking specifically at resource utilization, right? And I can customize which database am I going to look at within here, right? What do I have for my time frame? So if I'm having spikes in my pool and I want to try to figure out where that's occurring, I need to come into here to understand what database is potentially, right, bursting too much and then affecting other databases within that pool. So wide world importers here seems to be using a little bit more than my other databases. All right, I can come down here and I can see what peak CPU was. And if needed, I can take a database from one pool and move it into another. So if I come over here to my databases list, I can come down here to my wide world importers database, and I can say, I want to remove this database from the pool. Now, that isn't going to, I can make it so that I'm not just deleting the database, because I don't want to do that, but I can move that over to a different Elastic pool to be configured more appropriately for that database's workload. So I kind of liken this to those of you that might have done VM management, where we're talking about I'm setting up multiple VMs that are going to support my SQL Server databases, and how do I decide which VM the database should live on? It's kind of analogous to what's going on here, right? Sometimes you have to move those databases around in your VMs. Same thing in this scenario. So we're going to create a new Elastic pool for this one database because what we had was causing some contention with other databases in that pool. So we'll go ahead and create a new Elastic pool. And then when that's finished, we'll go ahead and move that wide world importers database into that different pool. So as a DBA or as a data person, right, we wouldn't typically have the ability to move those around in the VM world. You may not have the ability to go in here and create new Elastic pools and move your databases into them within your subscription, right? You may or may not have the permissions to do that. If you do, then one of the things that you have to be prepared for or make sure you're understanding is your cost, right? Because it can be really easy to create a new Elastic pool, potentially with the configuration, the resource configuration that's extremely high in cost, and maybe you just kind of weren't paying attention to that. So the benefit here within this, within the portal, is we get an idea of kind of the history of my database use within my pool, and then I can use that to estimate what I'm going to need in the new Elastic pool that I'm creating. So now if we go back to my original pool, right, performance looks a little bit better with that other database moved over to an entirely new resource. So you're not off the hook in terms of ensuring that the pool that you've allocated is enough for the databases that you've placed within it, right? You're setting your cap, your limit for what that pool can handle, and then everything that the databases need to do hopefully fits within that. So we've tried to make that easier. but it's still absolutely possible for you to hit the limits within the pool, which could potentially affect performance of that database. Does that make sense? Okay. Any questions about elastic pools? All right. Yeah. Would there be downtime? There is. It should be minimal, ideally, right? But essentially, it's a failover scenario, right? So just like in an on-prem world, right, where we're failing over from one to the other, there's some amount of downtime. Like, should it be minimal? Yes, ideally. Okay. So I do want to talk about the query editor because there are times when you need to run a pretty quick, short query, right, against your databases, and you don't need to fire up a tool to do that. You don't need to fire up Management Studio. Yes, I know sometimes it can take a long time for that to load. Well aware of that challenge. You may not be comfortable with Azure Data Studio, whatever. Whatever the case, it's totally fine, right? But this gives you the ability to run queries, right, against your Azure databases right within the browser. Hopefully, when you all take vacation, like you truly take vacation, but it's a nice option and a way to, check a few things from within the browser. So we're running this directly in the portal, supports a SQL Server login or Azure Active Directory, AAD, for those of you that are using that. You can open an existing file in the editor. You can save whatever script you've generated out to your local machine as well. And believe it or not, you have the ability to edit data within here, assuming you have the right permissions, right? So you can do this without writing a query. So for those of us who have worked with SQL for a while, like I see that and I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't think I really want people to be able to edit data like that. But if you are a new developer, if you've just created your database and you're not entirely comfortable with T-SQL, this makes it really easy, right, for you to throw data in here. You can do some create, update, delete operations, right, CRUD operations. There is a timeout in here as well. So some of these operations, right, that we are used to doing and that may run for an extended time may not work within the portal. So quick demo here on using the query editor, because again, this isn't something that I knew about. So it is in preview, and again, we can connect either with AAD or with SQL Server authentication. And then once we've connected, there's three main sections. We've got the navigation bar, we also have the editor itself or the window, and then we have a very slimmed down Object Explorer. Let me say it's very slimmed down, right? Not used to maybe what we're seeing in Management Studio. So once we've gone ahead and connected, again, AAD or as my user, I can go ahead and I can create multiple query windows, right? There's tabs across the top there. I can open an existing query. I can open up to 10 files, actually, at a maximum. You can also, I don't know if you noticed, you can import data this way. I'm not sure that I would do that, to be really honest. But again, sometimes people quickly just want to pull in some data, get up and running, see what they can do. So we've selected 2 queries here. We can open that and then use those. Within Object Explorer, if we expand that, right, we just have very slimmed down tables, views, and procedures. But within the table, we can expand this list to see all of the columns that exist for our table. We can't see the indexes. The ellipses, we can select out row, we can edit data, we can do a rename. So a lot of folks that I know tend to do that select top 1000 because they want to take a quick look at the data. Within your views, when we expand that, we can also expand a view to see the columns that exist within that as well. If it's an index view, we're not going to be able to see any of the indexes that are there. And again, for the view itself, we can select top 1000 rename. No ability to edit anything within the view, which would be expected. I wouldn't think that we would allow that capability in here at all. For my procedures, I get a nice list of my procedure. And if I expand that, which I think we do down here, right, we can see if it returns anything and what exactly it returns. We can script this out. So notice that for the table and the view, we didn't have a view definition, right? We didn't have a script as. We do have a view definition for the stored procedure. So we do have the ability to script that out to a new window. So from our list of tables, if we come back here and we expand this again, we can do a select top 1,000. And so put the query in there and go ahead and it runs that for us automatically, right? Gets our list out in the bottom, which you can scroll through, right? Take a look at this. One of the things that's interesting in here, when we go into edit data, notice that because it is marked as preview, you have to accept that it is a preview feature, right? If you go into Azure Data Studio or SSMS and you edit data, it just goes and lets you do that. Here, it's in preview, so you have to accept that. But I can add new rows to this. If I want to go ahead and create a new country. I can delete rows directly from here. And I'll be honest, as a DBA, this makes me nervous, right? That people can go in here and just willy-nilly delete rows and make edits like this. Because again, as a DBA, I tend to want to protect my data and not let folks come in here and have the ability to do these kind of operations. But it absolutely is possible. Save my changes. I can write a new query. In here, we do have IntelliSense, if you can see that popping up, right? So reasonable here for helping folks if they need to type T-SQL without ideally having to go over to Books Online and look up that information. Within the results that you have here, one of the things that I also think is interesting is that you can filter this a little bit further. I'll show that in a second here. You have the ability to rename the objects. This does an SP rename for you. It actually generates the T-SQL and then pulls that up here. So after I refresh, we can go and we can see that the table name has been renamed. Okay. And then last bit here, if we run this query and we get our output, if you go back up to the top here, I'm trying to tell McKenna what I want her to do in the demo here. I think she's going to listen. Let's see. Messages tab, no plans. Right? No ability to view plans within here. But do you see this search? I want her to go to this search. She's going to do that in a second. Once we do this, this fascinates me. You can search and you can narrow your result set. So if you're not comfortable with understanding how to filter your query any further, you can come in here and you can filter your result set to a smaller list. And again, as I mentioned before, you can save your query out to local machine. And you also have the ability to export data out as different file formats, right? So CSV in this scenario. And then I do appreciate that we've noted that if you can't do what you need to do within the portal, go ahead and open up Azure Data Studio. So I mentioned this in a session earlier today. We used to recommend actually in that window, actually let me just go back here real quick, just to get the black screen off. In the query editor window, here where it says, click here to open Azure Data Studio, we used to say SSDT, which is way more than folks who might be new to the portal would need, right? So the reason that we're recommending Azure Data Studio is because it's cross-platform, right? You can run it on Mac, you can run on Linux, you can run on Windows. And it's much more lightweight. And for folks who need to do a little bit more advanced query editor work, that would be, to me, a logical next step from the portal as opposed to going to SSMS, which is heavier, bigger, deeper in terms of its functionality and can be overwhelming for folks who are new to Azure. There's a question from the online folks. Thank you all who are watching. Would you recommend SSMS or the portal when you are needing to alter a data type for a column in a bigger table? In general, regardless of table size, if you are going to do an alter table command, I would highly recommend that you not do that in the portal, but you do that in SSMS or ADS, right? Anytime you get into DDL, data definition language, even creating objects might be okay, but modifying in particular, I would tend to do from SSMS or Azure Data Studio, because those are potentially significant operations in terms of duration transaction log, and I would prefer to have a much finer grain of control over them there, and I don't want to run into the timeout issue that I could run out here in the portal, right? Remember I said there's a 5-minute timeout. Altering a table, particularly if it's large, and depending upon what kind of change I'm making, may not be just a metadata change, but may involve touching every single row in the table, and I wouldn't want to do that through the portal. Okay. Any other questions about, yeah?
So you said you're nervous as a DBA?
I am nervous as a DBA. In general, yeah.
As a delete, would you cover that off though before signing off people using the IAD?
Would I have locked down their account? Yes, yes. So yes. The short answer is, if I had concerns about folks deleting data when they shouldn't, modifying data when they shouldn't, right? Principle of least privilege when creating their login or their account to ensure that they don't have the permissions to do that. So it may look like they could do it in here in the portal, right? But it would fail for them and that they wouldn't have the proper rights. But I just don't even want to give them the option, quite frankly. I don't want them to see it at all. All right. Let's see here. So that's all the things I wanted to show you. And I know that I am not fully through my time, which is totally fine, because I wanted to make sure we had time for questions and also potentially for feedback. So a lot of times in our sessions, right, we go the full 50 minutes and we get done and we're like, thanks, if you have questions, come see me later. Shorten this up a little bit so that we had time for questions and we also had time to capture feedback for my team members, if you have it, specific to the portal. Or you can just have your free time. But I'm happy to stand here and answer questions and take feedback about things you love or don't love. Yes?
You're mentioning the portal as the sole alternative, but most of these things you can do through RM as well.
Can do through
Azure Resource Manager.
Azure Resource Manager, yes. So I'm saying that the portal is where you can do things, right? Most of these things. You can also do some of these things through Azure Resource Manager, right? But that's another thing, right? And so what I hear a lot is that we want a one-stop shop. I want to go to one place to do what I need to do because I don't have to know things deep, right? And what can I do from the portal? So yes, Azure Resource Manager would be another alternative. But again, the majority of folks who end up using the portal, right? To be clear, the majority of folks that end up using the portal that we're getting feedback from, and I see it in the user comments. You know how you go into the portal sometimes and it'll ask you what you think? Do you guys ever get that, right? Some folks are not happy, okay? And it's fine, right? But the folks who are not happy are not the folks who've been working with SQL for a long time, right? They're folks who, this is not intuitive. Azure Resource Manager is way more than they need, right? So this should be an easy, intuitive interface for them.
Yeah, it was more a question of me getting confused.
Sorry, I did not mean to confuse you. If Azure Resource Manager works for you, live there. You don't have to come to the portal, right? Great point. Yes?
When would you use Azure Data Studio over SSMS?
When would I use Azure Data Studio over SSMS? I am so happy to answer that question, but let me set it over here for a second because I want to make sure that if I have because I could talk about that for the rest of this time, right? I'm happy to do that. But I want to make sure that if folks have portal-specific questions, that I answer those. Okay. So what I'm going to trust is that if you think of a portal question while I'm talking about this, you're going to interrupt me, right, and tell me, okay? So when would I use Azure Data Studio over SSMS, right, is your question. Was anybody in the Ask the panel this morning? You already heard this answer then. Okay. How long have you been using SQL? Right. You grew up with Management Studio, right? Management Studio was released in, right, 2005, right? Prior to 2005, we had Query Analyzer and Enterprise Manager. And so we got SSMS in 2005, and it was great, right? And SSMS is built on Visual Studio, right? You know that. So, but it's been around for 18 years. So I like to joke that it's a legal adult in the United States. And it was the main tool, has been the main tool for 15, 14 years, right? Easily. And as a result, it is very wide and it is very deep, right? And it is also geared toward on-prem. But for everything that you needed to do on-prem, right, you have to, I'm not gonna be able to do this quickly. You have to create databases, drop databases, create objects, delete objects, right? Insert data, query designer, database designer, log shipping, database mirroring, high availability groups, management, your logs, your linked servers, extended events, query store. What else am I missing, right? The kitchen sink, right? It's all within Management Studio. Now, you're newer to SQL.
No, I have built 10 years of SQL.
You got 10 years of SQL. Azure's new.
Yeah, more than 10.
More than 10.
Okay, I work in banking and we have all on premises and we use gateways
Okay.
to publish on the cloud.
Okay.
Power BI service.
Okay. You're Power BI. You're way beyond me. Okay.
No, I've worked with all of the technologies.
Okay.
One question. Okay, can I
I'll come back.
use the portal to manage other, for instance, I want to manage in terms of networking the Azure Synapse service.
Ooh, you want to manage that for Azure Synapse Service? I think so. I think so. But I'm not 100% sure, but I can find the person that will definitely answer that for you. Okay? So everybody in here is experienced with SQL, right? Do you all work with anyone who is new to SQL? What happens when you put Management Studio in front of them? What's that? It's a bit daunting. Perfect word. It's a bit daunting because it is so wide and so deep. So Azure Data Studio, one of the original reasons that Azure Data Studio was developed is because in SQL Server 2017, we added support for Linux. And if you're gonna run on Linux, you need a tool that potentially runs on Linux. SSMS, Visual Studio, do not run on Linux, right? So we needed a tool that would be cross-platform. There's also an increased number of users that continue to go to Mac, that continue to love their Macs. Totally fine, right? I'm a Windows girl. I expect I always will be. But there is an increasing market share that goes to Mac. So we needed a cross-platform tool. We had VS Code, right? Those who are engineers, developers, right? You probably know VS Code. So Azure Data Studio is a fork of VS Code. So it's cross-platform. It's lightweight. And it's, for those folks who are more dev-oriented, easy to use. It becomes a much easier entry into SQL for people who are new. It is much less scary. The things that are used the most in SSMS, and it's one of my greatest things about my job is I have all this telemetry now that I get to look at, right? You all know how much, I know you like data, right? I love data. So I can now see that we have tons of people who use Query Editor, and we have tons of people who use Object Explorer. Those are the two most heavily used things in SSMS, right? By far, once you've connected. So Azure Data Studio has those two things. Now what happened with Azure Data Studio is that then we kind of fell off and we went a different direction and we did a lot with notebooks and we did some stuff with big data clusters and we kind of didn't finish what we started, which is what we're gonna do now. But Azure Data Studio is going to be more Azure forward, right? In that there are things in SSMS that we don't support fully or well in Azure that we will do in Azure Data Studio. So we need to complete some operational scenarios, just some basic things. We need to improve some of that UX because there's not enough right-click create, right, options. We're adding that. But that's really going to be, I'm not going to try to convince anybody in here that you should switch from SSMS to Azure Data Studio. But sometimes when you just need to run a query real quick, that is going to open for you and connect way faster than SSMS, quite honestly, right? And for developers, we have SQL projects, we have GitHub integration, and we're not done there, which makes, you know, database DevOps a lot easier. So does that answer? You find Azure Data Studio less intuitive. Yeah. Okay, so what's interesting is that within, I'm going to tell you a little story here, and I know that I have a couple questions on the screen, so I have one on the screen, I will get to those. But I asked you about the feedback in the portal, how you can go in there and you can, you know, smiley face, frowny face, and leave a comment. We have that data in Azure Data Studio as well. So it gets asked, like, would you recommend this product to a friend or something like that, which I think is a not helpful question. But what we do also have is a comment. And I love when people leave comments. And they leave the most honest, brutal comments because they don't have to say it to anybody's face. And so I get the comment easy to use more than any other positive comment. So I agree with you that when I go into Azure Data Studio, when I went in there for the very first time, I was like, this is not the fork I know. This is not what I know, because it's so different than SSMS. But for a ton of other folks, it is way easier for them to use, which again is why I'm not trying to convert you, right? So for your folks who are newer, students, right, new developers, new DBAs, have them try that. It might just be a little bit simpler for them to get started. And then once they need the bigger things, right, if they're on-prem, then they can graduate up to SSMS. Okay, a question from someone who's online. Can you add the full server name for different databases in the portal and not just the server name? So the connection, I think you're asking for the connection string, Boris, and if so, I've actually never tried it. So let's see what happens here. Let me get the right window open. Let's see. Let me go to my overview. So this is, I'll be really honest, this is a scenario where I don't know what's going to happen. Okay? And we'll just see what's going to happen. So this is my connection string, right? I don't ever remember what this is. So we will just copy this, and we will open, just for fun, Azure Data Studio. And I'll launch, here, this is a fun exercise. Management Studio is already running. Okay, fine. Let's connect here. So the question that Boris is asking is, if I do this, will this work? Pretty sure the answer will be no. Hold on. That's not that login. This requires me to remember all of this, which I might not have remembered. Let me try over here. Let me create a new connection. Here's my server. Assuming I'm still on the internet, which I am. Does this one load? I'm a very impatient person. So I don't think you can do this. I don't think what Boris is asking is possible, but I'm willing to see. This, I can put the database here. Can I put it here and have it connect? I don't think this will work.
But the plan is to the management studio becoming deprecated.
Is Management Studio going to become deprecated? What did I say earlier? No. No. Breathe a sigh of relief. Right? No. There's a lot of work in Management Studio, right? And throwing that out the window at this point it doesn't make sense. In the next release of Management Studio, we'll pick up the new VS Shell, so we'll go to 64-bit. We're going to update the connection dialog, and we're going to pick up a new Microsoft Data Client, which is just kind of an underlying thing that we need to do. So there'll be an SSMS 20, actually, before you see another, that will be our next major release.
More memory allocation.
What's that? 64-bit will be good. More memory allocation, yeah. Boris, to answer your question, I don't think that you can do what you're asking to do, but feel free to send me an email if you want to follow up on that. I'm happy to do that. But no, we are not going to get rid of SSMS, so don't stress about that. Okay. I'm going to come to this slide here, and I'm going to, there we go. So I am out of time. This is my contact info. I can also connect you with Jess and McKenna if you have specific portal questions that I can't answer. Your Synapse question, please send me an email so that I can get the answer for you.
It's just not Synapse. If I open Azure Portal, if I have all of the resources that I've given, data factory, Synapse, if I could manage those on Azure Portal.
You can manage them on Azure Portal, yes.
Can you open if you have a service tab, just see, I know
If I have what?
a service.
Come on in, Grant. If I have a what?
No service option tab, just to see. That's the main. Okay.
Where do you want me to go?
All resources, for instance. You know.
Okay, all resources. I don't have a lot of resources in here, so I may not. Ooh, I lied. This is not the right instance I should be showing you. Yeah?
Thank you. Okay, I will. If I.
Come on, why don't you come on up here? Come on up here, and we'll take a look and see if we can figure out what you want. Okay? Does that work? All right. Feedback, appreciated. Appreciate you all attending and asking questions. Feel free to let me know if you have anything else. Grant's coming up next.